And I was asked by the interviewer live on the BBC News channel, you must be angered as a former army officer at the reality that the IDF is deliberately killing innocent women and children in Gaza and innocent civilians in Gaza. And I said to the interviewer, and this was bearing in mind this is live on the news channel, 24-hour news, I said to them, I'm not angry because that's not what's happening. The reality is that the IDF is taking greater steps than any other army in the history of warfare to minimize the death of innocent civilians on the battlefield. That, ladies and gentlemen, did not go down very well. The interview ended very quickly. And after that, I've very, very rarely been allowed to speak on Israel on the BBC.
So let me ask you a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience for some more. So you're obviously a big supporter of Israel. How did that come about? How did you become a supporter of Israel?
Well, I've always been, as a military person, I've always been deeply interested in Israel and the challenges it faces. And Israel, of course, is a country that was almost born in war. Because, of course, in 1948, when it was first refounded as a state, Israel then came under attack and has been under attack almost continuously since then, if not continuously. And I've always been hugely admiring of the courage, the resilience, and the capabilities of Israel to develop the country in an incredible way, in a way that's almost miraculous, while facing these multiple threats against its very existence. And so I think the story of Israel since 1948 is an inspiration for everybody, and particularly for military people who can see how important it is that a country that's under assault is able to defend itself so effectively. And I think we've seen that in the last 12, 13 months since 7th of October. And that was really how my interest first began with Israel. But the British Army, the British intelligence services, and the IDF have very, very close relationships, particularly at the top levels. And one of my experiences with the IDF, or with Israeli, particularly with Israeli battlefield medical technology, I can remember I visited a young 18-year-old soldier in hospital in the middle of England. He'd been blown up in Afghanistan by a Taliban bomb. He almost died on the spot, and the only reason he was alive that day was because he'd been administered an Israeli blood clotting agent which had saved his life. It was the most effective of its kind anywhere in the world. And that young man, who was 18 years of age, he lost one leg and an arm and an eye, and he knew that he was alive that day because of Israel's technology. And that's just one example of many I could give you of the interaction between Israel and the UK, and the reason why I'm so staunch in my support of Israel.
That's terrific. Let me dive into a core question that many of us have in the Jewish community around the world. We often hear the press and political leaders say Israel has the right to defend itself, but the civilian casualties are too high. You're a warfighter. You've been immersed in battles. Based on your experience, what's your analysis?
Well, I don't like it when people say Israel has the right to exist or Israel has the right to defend itself. We don't say that about any other country. I've never heard anyone say the United States of America has the right to exist and has a right to defend itself. These things are self-evident. Israel does, of course, have the right to defend itself, and not just the right, but the obligation and the duty to defend itself. And when it comes to civilian casualties, let's say in Gaza, people say Israel has imposed too many civilian casualties in Gaza. Well, the first thing is we don't know how many have been inflicted by the IDF in Gaza. We do know there's been a very large number. But what we also know is that Hamas deliberately fight among the civilian population in order to do one of two things: either prevent Israeli retaliation against their military actions against Israel, or to get Israel to retaliate and kill Gazan civilians, because Hamas want Gazan civilians to die in order to delegitimize and discredit Israel. So it's a really unfortunate thing that's going on, but it is the nature of war. Every war in history, particularly in modern times, has seen many, many civilian casualties. And this is no exception. By my calculation, Israel has inflicted, by ratio civilian to combatant deaths in Gaza, Israel has inflicted significantly fewer than, for example, the US and British forces did in Afghanistan and Iraq, fighting against a pretty similar enemy. It's not possible to make a calculation as to how much damage and destruction and devastation is too much. It's not possible to do that. You have to inflict as much damage and devastation and death as you need to in order to prevent the threat from continuing against your country. And that applied in the Second World War, in the First World War. It applied in all wars, and it applies in this war just as much. The only difference with this war is that so many people in the world are determined that Israel should be defeated and should stop fighting. And that's why we see so much adverse propaganda against Israel today, and so many lies and distortions about what Israel's doing. The IDF do everything they can to minimize civilian deaths in Gaza. But in the circumstances I've spoken about, it is impossible for that country to defend itself without, unfortunately, civilians in Gaza dying.
Thank you for that perspective. Given your experience, that's a very important message. You've been taking this message out to the world press, haven't you?
Since the 7th of October, or since the 9th of October, to be precise, I've been in Israel for almost all of the time. And the reason I've been there is so I can see firsthand exactly what's going on, and I can then apply my 30 years of military experience to the reality of what's happening in Israel, rather than just looking at it on a computer screen or watching television. I can actually see it for myself. I've been into Gaza many times with the IDF. I've observed the way they fight, and I'm able to then bring, with my own experience and my first-hand knowledge about what's going on in Israel, I'm able to, I hope, bring some kind of reality, not just to the media, which is very important, but also to political leaders around the world. And I've briefed many politicians in countries, including the United States, in Europe, in other countries around the world, including South Africa. And I've done my best to bring objective reality to what is a very, very distorted picture. And even politicians who are speaking in support of Israel, who understand the reality, even they lack a lot of objective knowledge and information about it. So I hope I've been able to influence them in the right way over this current situation.
Well, we're sure with your experience and credentials that you've had a positive impact. And for that, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. I'd like to open the floor if there are any questions from our audience. Please, we have a question here.
Yeah, thanks for everything that you do. Why do you think that there's not more kind of military experts or people with your background? You know, there are a few that are very outspoken and, you know, understand the consequences of war. How can we get more, whether it's U.S. military veterans or British military veterans or people that have, you know, are experts in this to speak out on behalf of Israel?
The first thing I'd say that almost all serving and retired military officers that I've met since this war began in particular share my views. They have the same perspective. They understand what's going on because in many cases, they've been in that fight themselves, not with, right. So they share the perspective. But how many speak out? Not that many. There's a few notable voices that do speak out and give their military expertise to this distorted situation. But it's not a great thing to do, because if you raise your head above the parapet on Israel, you're going to get it shot off. There's no question about that. People who've maybe spent much of their life in battle, they don't necessarily want to spend their retirement in battle as well. So it's not easy to get them to do so. But I think, as I say, most of them agree with it, but don't want to speak out. I've been with about, 5 or 6 groups of retired generals from NATO countries to Israel to see the war themselves, and in some cases actually to enter Gaza and witness the fighting themselves, and certainly to get a feel for what's going on. And even those who went there skeptical about Israel, and I think even the most seasoned military expert finds it hard to resist the intense anti-Israel propaganda and the lies that are talked about the war there. But even them, even the skeptical ones who go there, once they've seen it for themselves with their own eyes, they understand, they get the reality. And in many cases, they have spoken out. And one of them, for example, one British retired four-star general who was very skeptical when he arrived, he spent a week in Israel, he went into Gaza, he saw for himself, and afterwards he wrote an article in the Times in London explaining what the situation really was. So it is possible. It's quite intensive work to try and spread the word, but it's important. I think military voices are pretty important in this fight, particularly military voices of non-Jews and people from outside Israel, who it's much harder for the enemy to accuse them of lying and of spreading propaganda.
Well, I think you undersell your efforts and those of your colleagues on studying and reporting about, talking about what's going on in Gaza. You belong to a group called the High Level Military Group, a group of retired senior military officials, and just tell us for a minute or two your work with that group.
Right, the high-level military group is made up of a number of retired generals from around the world. I think we've got something like 30 or so on our books. And we've been in existence for a number of years. We went, for example, straight after the 2014 conflict in Gaza and wrote a report signed up to by all the members of the high-level military group, basically exposing and countering the lies that were told about allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity that the IDF were carrying out. And that work was pretty important. It was exposed to the UN Human Rights Council, which of course condemned Israel, exposed to governments around the world. We briefed the report in Washington, etc. And the names of many of these, some pretty prominent in their own countries in particular, these former generals, carries some weight in their countries and influences what the country's policymakers decide. And that group went to Israel, I think it was around February or March this year, something like that, maybe a bit later this year. We went to Israel, and it was one of the groups I mentioned just earlier on, which did a detailed investigation on the conflict and will be producing a report in the coming weeks, which I hope as many people as possible will read, because it tells the truth and gives the reality about a conflict that is so misunderstood.
That's so valuable. Thank you. We had another question over here.
Yes, telling the question, you're coming from Britain, and it's bad here, but it's so much worse for us Israelis in England now and in France, and a lot of Israelis are looking, okay, what destination they can go that without being harassed or without taking all the signs that are Israelis and without speaking Hebrew in the streets, which here maybe they don't feel it so much, but in Europe. So what is your outlook is going to be? I mean, we are looking forward and we see what will be in 10 years, and will we be able to change the public opinion ever anymore?
I think it's very difficult. The situation's descended so badly, and of course, it's driven by a couple of things. One is a very significant Islamic population in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, which in many cases, not in every case, but in many cases, they're educated from birth to hate Israel, and in many cases also to hate Jews. And you've got an increasing population, many of whom are voters, who have that perspective. And then you've got, on top of that, you then have an incredibly effective propaganda campaign against Israel, which gets traction among other members of the British population, particularly those people on the left who, while the left originally was very supportive of Israel, today the left of politics is much less so in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. And they've been influenced and affected by a very, very heavily resourced, well-planned anti-Israel propaganda campaign, which began in the 1960s and has just gained traction ever since then. It started, incidentally, by the Soviet Union, who deliberately intended to use Israel as a weapon against the US and UK influence in the Middle East. And that propaganda campaign has won over so many people in the UK and in Europe against Israel. And so you've got a very solid base among elements of the British population who are vehemently opposed to Israel. But on the other side, I would say the majority of the British population, and I don't have polling figures for this, it's to an extent instinct, there are indications in various different places, but on the other side there's a very strong element of supporters of Israel. I would say the majority of the British population support Israel. They're not the noisy ones. The noisy ones are the enemies of Israel. And these people, in most cases, while they support Israel, they're not necessarily invested in Israel to the extent that they're prepared to stand up in support of Israel. It's a minor element in their lives. So this is the difficulty. You've got a very organized and a very well-resourced anti-Israel campaign, and almost nothing on the other side, with the exception of large elements of the Jewish community who I think do the best they can. So in that situation, you've got, the only people really, I think, that can influence this campaign is the British government. The British government, they conducted a very effective information campaign in support of Ukraine when Russia invaded. Very effective. I wouldn't call it propaganda, but they certainly made sure the truth got out there about the reality of what was happening in order to garner the support of the British population for Ukraine, fighting for its life. I believe the British government should be doing the same thing about Israel and should not be the mouthpiece or the voice of Israel, but should certainly take as its duty the need to get the truth out there about the reality of the war. And why is it its duty? Even if you ignore the Israeli factor, there's a big Jewish population, a Jewish population. I wouldn't say it's that big in the UK, but there is a Jewish population which is under fire and under attack. And it's under attack as a result, to a large extent, of this propaganda. And so the government has a responsibility to try and alleviate that pressure and that anti-Israel, anti-Jewish feeling. And it should be doing so. I'm not confident that the current government in the UK will do so any more than the last government in the UK did.
Thank you for that perspective. I want to follow up on this issue of Britain. It's those of us who follow don't think the BBC is particularly fair when covering Israel and the wars with Gaza or with Lebanon. You've appeared on BBC. Tell us a little bit about your interaction with the commentators that may not be receptive to your message.
They may not be receptive. Yeah, that's one way of putting it. I was used a lot by the BBC shortly after I left the army as a military commentator on Afghanistan and Iraq. We're at their heights of the conflict at that time, and I was on the BBC several times a week, very often, in either television or radio. I was asked to go and do an interview as a result of that in 2008, I think it was, when the Gaza war Operation Cast Lead began. And I was asked by the interviewer live on the BBC News channel, you must be angered as a former army officer at the reality that the IDF is deliberately killing innocent women and children in Gaza and innocent civilians in Gaza. And I said to the interviewer, and this was bearing in mind this is live on the news channel, 24-hour news, I said to them, I'm not angry because that's not what's happening. The reality is that the IDF is taking greater steps than any other army in the history of warfare to minimize the death of innocent civilians on the battlefield. That, ladies and gentlemen, did not go down very well. The interview ended very quickly. And after that, I've very, very rarely been allowed to speak on Israel on the BBC. I sometimes speak on other subjects, like, for example, Ukraine. But I'm very rarely allowed to speak on the BBC against Israel because they have acknowledged me as a so-called military expert. And therefore, it's hard for them when one of their military experts goes against their anti-Israel agenda. And there's no doubt the BBC is anti-Israel, goes against their agenda. They can't really have you in the studio. And I should just add finally that a few years ago, the Simon Wiesenthal Center here in the United States drew up a league table of anti-Semitic organizations and entities around the world. Top of the list of anti-Semitic entities was the Islamic Republic of Iran. Number 2 was the BBC.
That's a fascinating perspective from an insider, someone who actually experienced it. Those of us who are involved in defending Israel suspect that was the case, but we appreciate your insights. Questions from the floor. Oh, okay, right here. Thank you.
Thank you, General Kemp, for your help in putting yourself out there and having a backbone, which a lot of people seem not to have. And you and Richard Spencer, I think, have been remarkable. My question is, getting beyond the buzzwords of using Palestinians as human shields in Gaza, I'm trying to understand. I mean, Hamas is Gaza. They're Gazans. They're family members. Why, in the mindset, the psyche, what's driving them to want to blow up their own family members or friends? And it's reciprocal too. What is driving in Palestinian, Gazan society? What is driving the population to allow that to be happen beyond, like we see the beatings, tortures, and intimidation by Hamas, but beyond that, they could be assisting the IDF more. Why not? Knowing there's summer camps and the UNRWA has indoctrinated them all, but they still can see themselves being used as human shields. So you can get a little more granular.
Yeah, I don't often use the term human shield because I think it's slightly misleading. I think what these people are in many cases is human sacrifices. Their lives are being deliberately sacrificed by Hamas in order to discredit Israel. And I mentioned before that Hamas specifically want the IDF to kill as many Gazan civilians as they possibly can get them to do. And the reason for that is, in broad terms, the reason for it is to discredit and undermine and isolate Israel, which has been successful in many respects. That's the purpose. In this war, even more so, their purpose is to get the international community to stop Israel from fighting against Hamas in Gaza, to try and put so much pressure on Israel they will stop. Because Hamas knew from the beginning, with the ferocity of the Israeli attacks, the justified ferocity, they couldn't possibly survive, they couldn't possibly win, and therefore they had to stop the fighting, and that necessitated the deaths of as many Gaza civilians as possible. Why did they do it? Because they're essentially religious fanatics. They are jihadists. Jihad is the most important thing. It's more important than human life, even their own lives and the lives of their families, because their religion tells them that no territory that's ever been controlled by Islam can in the future be controlled by any non-Muslim entity. And that's their religious driver. And that's why they are genocidists. They accuse Israel of genocide, but it's Hamas that's genocidist. Their charter calls for the destruction of the Jewish state. It calls for the killing of Israelis, and it also calls for the killing of Jews everywhere in the world. That is the Hamas charter. That's their focus. That's their dedication. And any price is worth paying to bring that about. Why do the people of Gaza go along with it? The people of Gaza have been so roundly indoctrinated over decades to hate Israel. In the schools, in the UNRWA schools that we fund, that your tax dollars fund, they are taught to hate Israel. They're taught in television programs. They're taught by the speeches of the leaders. They have it bred into them, a hatred for Israel. And I think any country, if you compare it to Nazi Germany, the Nazis were also indoctrinated. Many of the Germans were indoctrinated in Nazism, and we saw the consequences of that. And that's what we've got in Gaza as well. And it's going to be, people talk about the de-radicalization of Gaza. I think it's going to be a very hard thing to achieve, if not impossible to achieve. It may, I think, under Israeli rule, before Israel withdrew from Gaza, Gazans lived a much better life than they've lived under Hamas, a much better life. And that's aside from the conflict. So it's possible that, the elimination, the removal of Hamas, which I believe will happen from the governance of Gaza, could lead over a long period of time to something different. But it's not in any way a short-term project.
So I want to crystallize this because this is a very important point. When people say that if we had a, quote, two-state solution, unquote, the people of Gaza would be happy, Hamas would be happy, there would be no war, you've said that that's not the case. This war has nothing to do with a two-state solution. This is a religious war on the part of Hamas.
I think the idea of a two-state solution is obviously very attractive to most reasonable people around the world. To have a territory that has a predominantly Palestinian population controlling itself as its own state, and then a state with a predominantly Jewish population controlling itself. This is a logical outcome, I think. But in order to get there, you've got to have both sides wanting a two-state solution. You can't just have one side being prepared, and I believe Israel would be prepared to accept a two-state solution, not today, but previously, in previous years, and they've offered, under a number of different Israeli prime ministers, a two-state solution has been offered by Israel, and every time it's been rejected by the Palestinians. The fact is, the Palestinians, and I'm talking predominantly about the Palestinian leadership, will not accept a two-state solution. They want the annihilation of Israel. They want one state, which is an Islamic state, ruling over the whole territory. Their words, particularly when they're spoken in Arabic, confirm that. Their actions, their rejection of any possible compromise, also confirm that. And so the viability of a two-state solution, particularly after the horrors of the 7th of October, don't exist. They simply don't exist, no matter how desirable that might be. And actually polling in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, recent polling in the last few months shows the majority of the Palestinian population of the West Bank do not want a two-state solution. They do not support a two-state solution. So it's not just their leadership, it's also the majority of the population. In that situation, in those circumstances, it's impossible for it to happen. And in the case of Israel, which was before willing to accede a two-state solution, how could they do that now? After what happened on the 7th of October, before the 7th of October, there was a two-state solution. You had Gaza, which in a way was its own state, its own entity, and you had Israel. And what happened as a result of that? We saw what happened, and that's exactly what would happen if there came a situation where there was a two-state solution, including the West Bank.
Thank you for that perspective. I think we had a question on this side, the microphone.
I actually have
Oh,
one.
we have one here?
Sorry,
Okay.
I have a question. From your perspective, military expert, and knowing what you know about the situation on the ground in Gaza, is it possible, militarily probable, to bring the hostages home?
I think that the Israeli war objective, the two main elements of the Israeli war objective were to defeat Hamas and remove Hamas from governance of Gaza, and also to return the hostages. That's been the war objective since the beginning. Those two objectives are very much in conflict with each other. If you forget the hostages, which of course you shouldn't do, and Israel hasn't done, then destroying Hamas is difficult, but certainly possible. Destroying Hamas while at the same time getting the hostages back alive makes it very much more difficult to do. Yes, fortunately we've seen the return of some of the hostages. I think the best way to get the hostages back is to annihilate Hamas. Hamas is well on its way to being annihilated. And then there is a possibility that some of the hostages might be returned, but also there is a very strong possibility that in that process they might well be killed. So unfortunately it's a very, very contradictory set of objectives that you've got. The only alternative to that, I think, is to say, well, we won't deal with Hamas. We will negotiate with Hamas and we will get the hostages back. Hamas have shown themselves not willing to negotiate, and they've rejected all efforts at negotiation. And so they're not really interested in that game, which leaves you with the unfortunate situation of the continued war against Hamas and the possibility that many of the hostages will not return. I'm very sorry to say it. I've been involved myself in hostage rescue situations in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and I have immense sympathy, as I'm sure everybody here does, for those poor people who are stuck in captivity, have been for more than a year. They don't know what's going to happen to them today, never mind yesterday. But it's an unfortunate reality that Hamas was extremely clever in taking those hostages, and it's had a big effect on the prosecution of the war. But I don't think you can achieve both objectives conclusively, I would say.
Thank you. We did have a question here.
I was impressed with your talk yesterday in the Navigate Lounge. You were talking about Ukraine at that time. How does Turkey fit into this? I mean, Turkey gives drones to Ukraine, but at the same time, they have missiles that they obtained from Russia for defense. And they're a NATO state, which is confusing as it is. And how do they relate now with Israel, with this whole aspect going on, and as well with Jordan and Egypt? I mean, we're not hearing very much about what their influence is in this whole process.
Yeah, I think Turkey's in an interesting situation because, as you rightly say, they're a NATO member. But many of the things that Turkey does goes against NATO. And they're, for example, they're pretty, the leader of Turkey is pretty close to Putin. Whereas Turkey used to be a very good friend of Israel in many respects years ago, today it's very, very vehemently opposed to Israel. It supports Hamas. It has accommodated Hamas leadership and still does. So Turkey is playing a double game.
Russia would probably be the winner, let's say, in the contest with Ukraine. If that were to happen, how would that affect with Israel as well? Obviously, with Turkey mixed in that mix.
I think the reality in Ukraine, I think, is that the West, including the United States and the UK, have not done enough to enable Ukraine to resist the fight against Russia. They've done a hell of a lot, don't get me wrong. The US particularly has contributed vast amounts of military equipment and finance to Ukraine, but they haven't done enough. And they knew they weren't doing enough. They were too restrained by fear of the Russian nuclear threat to actually go as far as they needed to go. And so the outcome is likely to be, maybe in the coming weeks or months, the outcome is likely to be some kind of end to the war, which is either a frozen conflict or a peace deal, which sees Russia maintaining control of the Ukrainian territory it has today. I don't think the West has the commitment, shall we say, or the courage to bring about any different outcome to that. And of course, you mentioned Turkey in particular, but you've got a situation where you have Russia, Iran, China, all allied with each other against the West. And that's why, and Turkey's in that mix as well in a slightly more blurred perspective. But that's the reason why the war in Israel now, the Iranian war, is our war as well. Because the Iranian war in Israel is only part of the picture. It's a war against the West. It's a war against the United States in particular. And so all of these different alliances, this axis that I've spoken about, particularly Iran, Russia, and China, are extremely, extremely dangerous for our future. And if we don't give all of the support we need to allow, not just to support Israel, but allow Israel, which the current US administration has not done, allow Israel to go as far as it needs to go in defeating the threat against it, then that threatens us as well.
Same monetary system as well.
Another question?
Thank you for being here.
Hold the microphone a little closer. Thank you.
My question is, how will Trump affect the policies strategically? I know it's huge globally, but just in Israel and the Middle East. What's your opinion?
I think the Biden administration has provided enormous amount of support to Israel in this war, and that includes sending aircraft carrier strike groups to the Mediterranean, to the Gulf. It includes supplying vast quantities of munitions. It includes diplomatic support for Israel in organizations like the United Nations. So the Biden administration has been very, very supportive of Israel, but they haven't been supportive enough, because I think the most significant factor affecting this war from the White House has been restrictions placed on Israel, which have prevented Israel from prosecuting the war in Gaza and, to an extent, in Lebanon and against Iran, to the extent that Israel's needed to do so. And I think this war could have been, particularly the war in Gaza, could have been ended much earlier if the restraints hadn't been placed on Israel that were. my hope, and I don't have any insights into this, my hope is that the next US administration will free Israel up to do what it needs to do and give it whatever support it requires to do that. I'm not suggesting that President Trump, for example, is going to be willing to commit the US to an attack on Iran, which is necessary. I'm not suggesting he's willing to do that. But I do think he's likely to free Israel to do what it needs to do to Iran to eliminate or significantly reduce the threat that Iran poses to Israel. I hope so, anyway.
Okay. One question here.
So thank you. We talked about this a little bit before, but I think it kind of goes to the question that he discussed. Talk a little bit about Qatar, the challenges, the opportunities that we have with the new administration, or if they're just kind of playing both sides and they're really not a help at all.
Yeah, Qatar is not quite like Turkey, but it's a conundrum. And of course, one of the major US, if not the major US military bases in the Middle East is in Qatar. Yet Qatar is also hosting one of Iran's terrorist proxies, Hamas, and supporting Hamas as well. So Qatar is trying to play both sides. And I think the current US administration, as part of its, because one thing that people may not understand about the administration in the White House at present is its almost fanatical appeasement of Iran, its determination not to undermine Iran as best it can, and that the root of that comes from the Obama administration and the nuclear deal that Obama struck with Iran, which was, by the way, a very, very dangerous nuclear deal, but was portrayed as being something that would prevent Iran getting a nuclear weapon, which it hasn't. And the determination by Biden to return to that deal, that led to years of appeasement against Iran, and part of that was appeasement of Qatar as well. So I would hope, again, it's a hope, not necessarily a guarantee at all, but a hope that the new administration will not only give Israel everything it needs, every support it needs to defend itself against the Iran and its proxies, but will also end the appeasement of Iran, will impose maximum pressure on Iran, as occurred under the previous Trump administration, and by extension, pressurizing Qatar to end its double war.
So I'm going to close. We have time for one more question. Do we have a question from the floor?
I want to ask a question. We've heard a lot, and this is amazing. It was very enlightening in terms of how with the world and how is viewing this. I want to look inside to our community, to the community that's here. World Zionist Village is a place where the idea is to strengthen our own resilience, to learn, to understand, and to look within our. So, what is the message of potentially to us as Zionists? Is how do we strengthen ourselves in light of what's all this disinformation and hate that's coming out? What are your thoughts on that?
You're asking a goy to tell the Jews what to do. Okay, I'll do my best. I mean, I think.
I said Zionists.
Okay, yeah. So there's many, probably more. There's more non-Jewish Zionists than there are Jewish Zionists, actually, particularly in the United States of America. I think one thing I would say, and it's a very broad-ranging question, which the answer would take me a long time to give properly. But one thing I do believe, and it's something I said right at the beginning, is that the work of JNF and other pro-Israel organizations, Israel-supporting organizations, is fundamentally important, not just to the development of Israel itself, but also to the strengthening of the Zionist cause around the world. I think it is so important. One thing I've found encouraging here in this summit, is it a summit or a conference?
Conference.
Okay,
We
I call it this in
We
this
can
summit.
call it a summit.
This is a summit of top-level leaders like us, two of us. The one thing that I've found very encouraging is the focus that the JNF, and it's not just the JNF. There are other Israeli supporting organizations as well, which play their part. the focus of the JNF on Jewish youth, and there is the high school summit here as well. I had the privilege of speaking to them yesterday, to many of them, and also the I think you call it college students here. We call them university. As Churchill said, two people divided by a common language. But this is so important because, I mean, looking around the place, there is actually, compared to many similar events I've been to, there is actually quite a healthy mix of ages. But very often in Zionist organizations, you see old people like me there more than young people. And I think that's a real danger. And from my perspective, I think the more emphasis that the Zionist world can put on supporting its youth, building its youth, and encouraging its youth, I think that's got to be absolutely critical, because, of course, it goes without saying that that's the future, and the future of Zionism is nothing without young Zionists. And I've been encouraged not only by the focus that JNF has put on that, but also by the spirit of the young people I've met here. They are, I mean, obviously they wouldn't be here if they weren't committed to the cause, but I think the willingness that they have, that they seem to me to have, to stand up for themselves, to defend Zionism, I think is deeply impressive. And that's some, when you consider, particularly at universities around the US, in the UK, elsewhere, in Europe, I've been to many campuses here and in other countries. And when you look at the battlefield that these campuses very often are, we all, every single one of us, need to do everything we can to support these young people who are facing such a tough struggle at the universities. And I would encourage anyone listening, as well as supporting the Zionist village, support the Zionist youth who are going to go there, but also the ones who aren't. I think it's critically important. I'm going to give, sorry, we've got to finish. I'm going to give one shout out, and this is probably illegal.
No.
I want to give a shout out for one organization that I'm involved with, which is also supported by the JNF, which is called what I would call Club Z, but they call themselves Club Z. I can't say Z being British, but we can't pronounce the letter Z. But they're a phenomenal organization, I think, which should be boosted and replicated. And they essentially, as a military person, I look at it from this perspective, they prepare high school students, Jewish high school students. They give them training for the fight they're going to face on university campuses. That is so important. You wouldn't send a soldier into battle without training them to fight. Similarly, we shouldn't be sending Jewish young people from high school to university without training them how to fight against the enemy they're going to face in these universities.
That's a great message. We could go on for hours. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts with us this morning. But first of all, I want to thank you for your defense of freedom and your work on the ground to help protect Western society. We in the United States and in Israel know that we can't fight this battle alone, and we need partners like the British and like yourself to help us. Thanks for your insights. To our audience, thank you for your participation. Make sure to follow us on social media at World Zionist Village on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And stop by our pavilion all day long for these kind of great conversations with thought leaders, world-class thought leaders like the Colonel.